Good morning, everyone. Today's May 8th, 2026. My name is Nate Wrights, and I'm going to call the Task Force on Mandatory Minimum Sentences to order. Don, would you please call the roll?
Shane Baker. Shane Baker is not here. Jeremiah Carlson. They're ceiling mics. Jeremiah Carlson. Saw him here for a moment, but come back. John Donovan.
Here.
Mark Haase.
Here.
Dale Harris.
Here.
Amber Johnson.
Here.
Kelly Mitchell.
Here.
Mark Osler. Mark Osler. Nate Wrights.
Here.
Ken Sass. Ken Sass. Nick Sasser said he would not be available today. Dr. Stewart is going to be a little late today. Ashley Stewart's Griffith.
Here.
And we do have a quorum.
Great. All right, so the next item on the agenda is approval of the April 2026 meeting minutes and the agenda. So you've got the, actually we don't have to approve the agenda, but let's start with approval of the April 2026 meeting minutes. Any additions or corrections to the April 26 meeting minutes? You were given these as part of your packet earlier this week. Any additions or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, the minutes will stand adopted as drafted. And then any suggestions for changes to the agenda? Ashley.
I don't have suggestions. I don't know if anybody else is having this. I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing. I don't know if you can move the speaker a little closer.
Yeah, we are in a room that has ceiling mics. For the in-person people, if you could just speak up just a little bit, you should be able to be heard.
Okay, thank you.
You've got a handheld mic if you'd like to use
That's
that.
all we got?
Yes, there are no table mics in this room.
Try that. You think that'll just work?
Should.
Here you go.
If you want. Yep. It's good.
Is this any better, Ashley? Yes.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay. Sure. And I can be a little soft spoken, so I appreciate that. So did you hear us earlier when we asked for any corrections for the minutes? And okay. So now just wondering if anybody has any suggestions for changing the agenda. Otherwise, we can just proceed with the agenda. All right. So the third item on the agenda is preliminary findings of stakeholder input, MJRC. Who do we have here from MJRC? Okay.
Oh, they might have to
Just
be
a second. They
elevated.
might be on. Just a second. I got
Well,
Edie
gotcha.
Cunningham making a panelist right now.
Okay.
Good morning. Sorry, I thank you for doing that.
Well, welcome. And I'm actually not sure where you are in the process. Are we rushing you by asking you to present already in May, or?
No, this is really, it has been a rush no matter what.
Sure.
But this is sort of a ideal time for us to get a little bit of feedback. So it's very much like what we'll be sharing with you is sort of preliminary, or I should say is preliminary. There are some big themes that we're that we are confident and clear and excited to share, and others that are sort of just emerging. So the goal today will just really to be presenting kind of our methods and who we've heard from. So that's very concrete at this point, but we'll spend the next several weeks really digging in. So
Super. Yeah, Mark Osler is up on the.
So that's Mark Haas.
He's not. He is
He's up
showing
there.
as.
He's up there.
Is he?
Yeah, he is. I mean, you have to look on the screen.
Oh, I
'cause
don't
there's
have
some-
that.
Yeah, I've never been able to log in as a panelist, so I'm as a participant. Can someone switch me over?
You are switched over, Mark. We got you.
There we go.
Sorry about that, Katie. Just trying to,
no worries.
the joys of remote meetings.
Hybrid meetings. Yep. But let me know. I'm ready to dive right in. If that sounds good to you all, let me know what else you might need.
That sounds great.
Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen. From my team, Jeanette is here also, but I'm going to do the talking today, but Jeanette will be available for questions and stuff too. And it looks like she's been made a panelist as well. So thank you so much. So I'm going to share my screen. So is that right? And then I'm going to try to keep it 15 to 20 minutes. Does that still sound okay for time?
I think so.
Okay. So I'm going to try to, do I have screen sharing permissions is the next question, but I think I should. So let me try and see if folks can see my slides on my screen.
Yes.
There you go.
Okay, amazing. So like I mentioned, I'm going to spend a little bit of time today going through what we're calling kind of our preliminary findings. So our agenda, just sort of a recap of the methods. I think we've connected with most of you before, but just a reminder of how we embarked on our feedback process, go through some of our high-level findings from our survey, focus groups, and interviews. And then we'd like to leave a little bit of time. I'm going to try to keep time for feedback or discussion or reactions from you all as we sort of continue to shape our analyses. So as a reminder, and in terms of my process, like feel free to interrupt me. I have my slides up now, so I can't really see anybody. So just like holler at me if you want to interrupt me or if you have questions. So who we are, the Minnesota Justice Research Center, or the JRC, MNJRC, we're an independent nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to driving meaningful change to Minnesota's criminal legal system through rigorous and community-centered research, education, and policy development. So that is sort of our whole stated mission. I say it all today because a big focus of this feedback process for us was really to connect with community members and system actors both, and sort of all the folks who are directly impacted by or work within systems, either sending down mandatory minimum sentences or experiencing them. We wanted to hear from folks. So our methods, our plan, our goal was really to try, so with the really, short time frame. So while I'm a recovering academic, so academics are often like, you need 2 full years as a community-based researcher, we're often trying to make things happen fast so that we can actually see change and impact and outcomes. But at the same time, usually we also want to take considerable time to connect with community members and build trust and explain projects and processes. So this has been an absolutely warp speed project on our end, but it's actually gone really well. So that's awesome. So we set out to try to at least get about 20 to 30 participants total. And our goal was to get a spread of practitioners, system actors, victims, and their families. So the goal was to really connect with people sort of on both sides of our adversarial system, and then also justice impacted individuals. We set out to do this through focusing on interviews, and those interviews would be with the victims and family members, really to create, again, that sort of like safe space to discuss their experiences and feedback on the mandatory minimums. And then focus groups with those convicted of crimes to, again, sort of get more perspectives into the room and create those shared spaces for discussion. We also wanted to send out a survey to practitioners with the goal of getting a handful of responses in the window. So what happened? what did we actually get? So total, we were able to have 95 participants, which is amazing. We're feeling really excited about it. And the bulk of those came from the survey. So we thought we were not just putting the survey out like far and wide. We were sort of doing targeted distribution with folks that we had contacts with, and then said, please share. Many of you did. And so with that sort of rolling methods, we assumed that the survey uptake would be relatively slow, and we're surprised when folks were really excited to take it and share with their colleagues. So that was awesome. So we had a total of 77 system actors, criminal justice practitioners. We were able to connect with 4 victim survivors. That was, as we anticipated, definitely the hardest reach group. And then 6 family members, both of victim survivors and of those convicted of crimes with mandatory minimums. And then we had 13 total justice impacted individuals. So the way that data collection unfolded was through 5 interviews. So we had a handful of family members actually join focus groups depending on relationships. So that worked out pretty well. We held 2 focus groups at our office in Sabathani. And then, like I said, the 77 system actors participated through survey responses. We did get one, and then we have a second scheduled follow-up interview with system actors. A lot, I don't know the exact, I don't remember the exact number, but like over 30 practitioners wanted to follow up with a one-on-one interview. So they had a lot to say and a lot of feedback to give, but just because of time, that was sort of our last priority for interviews. So we really focused on interviews with impacted folks, but there are still a lot of folks out there who really wanted to dig in. So we wanted to schedule a couple of those interviews. So that is our universe. So what did this population look like? So first, when I talk about survey respondents, again, I'm talking about practitioners or system actors. I'm kind of using those terms interchangeably. So we got a pretty good mix in terms of sector representation. So if you look at this pie chart, it's about half courts, half what we grouped as kind of reentry or probation. And then the courts breakdown is about a little more than a quarter PDs, about 12% prosecutors, and 6% judges. So we got a handful of judges, which was exciting. And then kind of a small mix of law enforcement, policy advocacy folks, and I think 1 or 2 people who identified as like community legal or working in jails. Below that pie chart, as you can see, the experience was pretty mixed, which was really great. We wanted to get a mix of perspectives, folks who have been doing this for a long time and folks who are new to the legal space. So the mean number of years that folks have been in their role was 12, but it was really kind of split about like a third early career, so less than 5 years, and then another third, like what we would call mid to senior, so 11 to 20 years. And then we had a kind of a handful of each mid-career, that 6 to 10 range, and then a handful of folks who had been in their role for more than 20 years. In terms of location, we had more than half the sample from Greater Minnesota. For us, this was a win. So we are, Twin Cities based and Twin Cities focused in a lot of ways. And we work hard to get a broader Minnesota reach. The bulk of that was driven actually by the probation group. So we had a couple of partners who distributed to their lists of folks who do reentry and probation work outside of the Twin Cities. And so the bulk of that population was from Greater Minnesota, but also a handful of judges and I think 2 or 3 PDs and prosecutors from Greater Minnesota too. And then the rest was a mix of the metro and then the cities themselves. In terms of demographics, this is perhaps unsurprising to you all, almost entirely a sample of white folks. We had a little bit of mix of BIPOC folks. So I think 1 person who identified as Asian American, and 1 American Indian or Indigenous person, and then a couple, like 4 or 5 Black folks or Hispanic folks. And then about a sort of a split along gender lines with about a little more than half of our participants who were women. So when it comes to so that was for our practitioners. When it comes to our focus group and interview participants, total, we had 18. If you're like really fast at math and doing numbers, you're going to be like, wait, 6 and 4 and 13. As you know, the sort of identities of individuals really overlap, right? So when we're talking about a person who might be a family member of somebody with a mandatory minimum sentence and or convicted of a crime, that in some ways, or in many cases, that could be the same person. We also had people who identified as both victims and family members, right? So these numbers are not perfectly adding up. But our total individuals for this larger group was 18. When it comes to those with mandatory minimum charge, it was a pretty good mix. About a quarter being those who identified as victim family. There was a couple of folks who were able to really clearly list the statute and give, date of births and names of their family members so that we could identify with more specificity the mandatory minimum, but the bulk of folks didn't have a great sense. But then for those convicted of crimes, it's about a quarter drug, about a quarter guns, and then a quarter like other. So failure to register, I think there was one terroristic threats and a couple of other mixed in there. In terms of, again, their sort of connection to the mandatory minimums, like I mentioned, this is really overlapping. So people identified as both those who serve time and a family member, but we had about half of our sample with their experience that they were referring to as people who had served mandatory minimum sentences, and the other half as family members or victim survivors. And then finally, when it comes to number of years, the bulk of the folks who had served time served long sentences. So about 44% had more than 10 years. And we checked these with MCRO to sort of confirm their sentences. And then there was about a mix between like 6 to 10, 3 to 5, 1 to 2, and less than a year. Most of those unknowns, again, are the victim family members who didn't have a sense of their the length of sentence. When it comes to demographics for this group, this was primarily Black or African American individuals, and we had about a third women, which to me was impressive. Like I think we often have relationships and connections to men in the reentry and formerly incarcerated space. So this was awesome to get a good group of women, because this was not just what we might assume family members or victim survivors. We had in both focus groups, we had at least one, if not two, women participants, so folks who had served mandatory minimum sentences. So that was awesome to get diverse perspectives here. So I am going to talk about, like I mentioned, sort of preliminarily, we really set out to focus on these three big questions. And these were developed with a consensus workshop with all of you. So the big sort of three core things we were digging into was understanding and purpose, right? How folks understand mandatory minimum sentences. Do they know about them? Do they understand how they work? And then their intended role, their purpose. Then we dug into like how they sort of unfold in the case process, how they might influence decision-making in the practitioner space, and then also the experiences of individuals throughout that case process. And then finally, the lived experience and impacts. So what are the almost like sort of collateral consequences, broader personal, familial, and community impacts of these sentences. So today we're just going to talk about this first one. This is where we had a lot of good data from the survey that we've been able to analyze thus far and pull in some data from our focus groups and interviews, but we're digging into the other two. And in about a month, we'll share all of our findings. So one big takeaway from this process for us is that the topics of getting feedback, it's sort of a wonky question, right? Getting feedback for practitioners, it was not too hard to answer. For impacted folks, victim survivors, the sort of almost like wonky question of feedback on mandatory minimum sentences specifically was really challenging for folks to sort of disentangle from other perspectives about serving time and prison more broadly. So what we found in some ways was the feedback we got sort of fit almost like a funnel. So folks, when asked about mandatory minimum sentences, oftentimes would sort of like go up to this question about the necessity of prison time more broadly, right? Above and beyond or connected to mandatory minimum sentences. And as we started to focus, we did get some feedback where folks were really digging into this question of the length of sentence, right? So sort of like, again, above and beyond mandatory minimum as a mechanism to create a length of a sentence. Folks had a lot of feedback on length of sentence as being connected to certain crimes, as being deterrent, or as being punishment. And then we were able, in many cases, but it sort of took us longer through the focus group and interview process, to really drill down to this question of the use of mandatory minimums as the tool, right, as the specific mechanism or way to determine a length of sentence. But we did find that because these topics, they're distinct, right, but they're really hard to disentangle, we got a lot of feedback on kind of all of the above. So here are high level, here are the 3 big takeaways I'm going to present today, and I'll dig into each of these. I think I started at like 9:06, so in the next like 6 or 7 minutes. So first, understanding high level, we found that system actors very clearly and complexly understand mandatory minimums, what they are, how they work. Impacted participants are almost across the board unaware, I should say, were unaware prior to serving time. This finding was not particularly surprising for us, but it was really confirmed in our data. When it comes to purpose, system actors named, without getting any kind of prompting, 4 core theoretical purposes. They talked about consistent sentencing, deterrence, punishment, and accountability. Those things aren't the same, but they sort of like grouped the same in the feedback that we got in the short answers, and public safety. When we asked our impacted folks, both victim survivors and folks who served time, the thing that came up for people as what they believed was the intended purpose of mandatory minimums was to serve harm, to cause harm, and to serve as a tool for racial control. So this came up in really interesting and different ways. Lastly, when we think about those purposes, so we engaged in a lot of sort of questions and answers about like, what is the goal? What is the purposes? What are we setting out to do? And then we talked about like, what's working? Are those purposes being achieved? System actors and impacted people really align strongly on this perspective that mandatory minimums do not deter crime. They do not serve as a deterrent. And that they do punish those who commit crimes. And there were sort of mixed perspectives on whether or not that was what we wanted, but there was alignment that they served as an effective punishment tool. And when it came to accountability, again, depending kind of on role and experience, there was some more mixed feedback. When it came to consistent sentences, and I'll dig into this in a second, there were some really mixed perspectives on whether or not they actually work to serve the purpose of achieving consistent sentences. So when it comes to understanding system actors, like I said, a strong majority report some or complete understanding. About 67% then when asked to, do you believe that community members before committing an offense have any knowledge? The majority said they didn't believe it, and that was really borne out in our data. Participants across the board expect that they or the person who committed the offense had no idea what a mandatory minimum was beforehand. When it comes to purpose, as I mentioned, these 4 came out. The most commonly cited purpose was this sense of consistency or uniformity in sentences. So we heard things in the short answers like mandatory minimums are here to ensure unbiased sentencing. Fairness was really connected to this consistency and uniformity in an interesting way, and actually unfolded really differently with participants than it did with system actors. But the sense of sort of default, uniformity, consistent sentences, that was the most commonly cited purpose. Deterrence also came up nearly as commonly as consistency, but it was almost always with skepticism baked in. So even when the question was just like, don't think about what it actually does, but what is it supposed to do? People had responses like, well, the alleged purpose is deterrence, or in theory, mandatory minimums are supposed to be deterrent. About 20% of participants cited punishment or accountability as a purpose. So the goal was to make sure defendants, here's a quote from one participant, to make sure defendants receive at least a minimum punishment. Sometimes we saw just short responses like, the point is accountability. These are for accountability. And then about 20% cited public safety, really connected to this sense of incapacitation. Also, this one had considerable skepticism baked in. So one example of a response to that was the point is to keep dangerous people off the street for a defined period. When it came to our impacted folks, they were much more skeptical of these sort of more practical purposes that we heard from practitioners. And instead, in the focus groups and in the interviews, we often sort of really started high level, like what comes to mind for you when you hear that word? What do you think were the intended goals? What do you think were the purposes? And dug into those questions. And most of the conversation was a discussion about sort of ensuring consistent prison populations, right? So there was a lot of discussion about like, well, longer sentences make sure that people stay in prison for a long time. So that's probably what they were trying to do. There was a lot of discussion about for-profit prisons and about contracting. I think that in the first focus group, we talked a lot about modern slavery and that mandatory minimum sentences, longer sentences, serve that purpose more strongly. Folks turned to this question of appearing tough on crime. So mandatory minimum sentences, they thought the purpose was to show that we were serious about crime. So you did something, you were going to serve a long sentence regardless of what the circumstances of your individual case was. And then there was a lot of discussion also even in the interviews about social control and in particular racial control. So that first quote at the top right was a really interesting quote where a participant said, if we're talking about some of the main categories for mandatory minimums, and we're talking about guns and drugs as two sort of categories of topics, think about this. In the 60s, you had Black Panthers, then our community got flooded with drugs. I'm hearing population control. Mandatory minimum sentences for these things seem to be targeted. So we had some really interesting conversations there. Whether or not these were working. So this is the last thing we'll talk about. So consistent sentencing was cited as the most common purpose, but there's some really interesting mixed perspectives on whether or not they were actually doing that. So in total, less than half of system actors agreed that mandatory minimums work to produce more consistent sentences. And this was really split along role. So when it comes to, let's see, let me look at my notes on this one. Oh shoot, I didn't have the breakdown, darn. Okay, that's okay. So I want to say the most sort of generous or the most split were PDs and prosecutors. I think it was like 56% of public defenders said that they sort of like agreed that they produced somewhat more consistent sentences, but it was pretty split. But the group that disagreed the most were judges, which I just thought was really interesting, right? So 80% of judges, now I think our judge N is, I want to say 7 or 8 folks. So not a huge sample, and I can go back and look. But 80% of those folks disagreed that they actually work to produce consistent sentences, which I just thought was really interesting. And we haven't analyzed the short answer. So we asked for follow-up, like tell us more about why you chose that answer, disagree or strongly disagree. And so that I'm excited to dig into that data. When it came to our focus groups and interviews, impacted people really strongly believed that this sort of sense of consistency, again, they really had a hard time disentangling the sort of like practical, almost utilitarian notion of like unbiased or consistency as being unbiased. And they really sort of disagreed with the premise, right? They were like, consistency to us basically means it's unfair, because if you're being consistent, you're taking away an individual story. So almost to a person, and again, this was our victim survivors, these were impacted folks, we heard things like, it's such a gray area. Not every case is the same. As far as things that aren't like affecting a person physically, I think that they should do things more case by case by case, because not everybody's crime was the same. Regardless of what happened, you have no options. You have to take that to the chin, right? So these perspectives that once you have that, in theory, unbiased or consistent sentence, it means that you don't get to sort of argue for your individual circumstances. When it comes to deterrence, this was really sort of our across the board strongest finding. System actors and impacted people all really agreed that it didn't work. And fundamentally, in order to function for deterrence to work, you have to know about it, right? And so we heard a lot of impacted individuals saying like, I you can't be deterrence if I don't really know that a mandatory minimum sentence is existing. Like that can't serve to deter me from committing crimes. But even those who had some awareness, so we dug in a little deeper because we had folks in the room that had like second or third offenses. These folks were like, yeah, well, it wasn't about like knowing that there was a mandatory minimum over my head that was going to stop me from doing things. The reason why I, engaged in this behavior is we're really having much more to do with life circumstances. And I wasn't deterred by knowing I might go away again. So this quote from one of the participants in our focus group, time wasn't the issue. I can do time on my back. I was in and out for 11 years. I didn't care about the time. Mandatory minimum doesn't quite set a point. What ended up saving me is getting more information about me. I learned about myself, trials and tribulations through the passing of my mother. So for this person, they weren't deterred from committing crimes by these longer sentences that they were serving. This quote from a public defender sums up pretty well what we heard across the board from system actors, was that, I can assure you my clients are not aware of these minimums and do not make their decisions accordingly. So for system actors, 70% said that they were somewhat or extremely ineffective as serving a deterrent role. And then lastly, in regards to punishment, both impacted participants and survey respondents really agreed that they acted as a sort of a tool for punishment, but there was a lot of discussion around, like, is punishment an effective way to do other things that we want, right? Promote public safety or deter crime. And then there was also lots of really robust conversation about the sort of proportionality of the punishment. So both from system actors and impacted people, we heard things like mandatory minimums definitely punish the client, but in my opinion, more harshly than necessary in most situations. So like I said, going back to that sort of first point about the funnel, there was this sort of, when we drill down, people were like, yes, they're a harsh punishment. If you commit this crime, you're going to get this harsh punishment. But then quickly the conversation turned to like, and what is, like, is that what we want from our system? Just harsh punishment? Or are we trying to create a system where people are accountable, or deterred from committing further crimes? So that was a whirlwind, I know, and I took even more time than I said, 24 minutes instead of 20 minutes. But I just, we're getting a lot of rich data. We're going to go through and analyze all the qualitative data from the survey responses as well, in addition to wrapping up one more interview and then really digging into those other two questions. But we wanted to see if folks had any feedback or questions that they still have as we work through the data in the next couple of weeks.
Questions? Dale?
I was just wondering, the comments about racial disparities, was there any significant difference between the guns and the drugs on those responses, or was it pretty much across the board?
It's a really good question, and I think that we could answer it. I don't know offhand, but we could dig into that for sure.
Mark?
Yeah, thanks so much, Katie. And it's interesting because especially the deterrence responses that you got are consistent with the discussions we've had previously, and what scholarship has shown consistently.
Yep.
One thing I'm wondering about in terms of the sample is that you only had about 5% from Hennepin, but it's something like 24% of the state's population. Do you think that's risk skewing things that you
mean for the system actors, or for the, yeah?
I think overall for the 77 in whole, it was.
Yep.
5%.
We had 5% from Minneapolis. So we had 33% from this one, Twin Cities Metro. So that could very well be Hennepin. But 5% of the sample was from Minneapolis. I wonder if I could see where the Twin Cities Metro is by county. That's a good question. I'll look. I can't remember if we asked that.
But it does seem like it's surprisingly, because we don't see this very often. Usually we see an overrepresentation of Twin Cities people, but this seems to be an overrepresentation of greater Minnesota. I'm just wondering if that is something that needs to be controlled for.
Yeah, one of the things I want to do is sort of, because like I said, that representation was driven largely by probation. Like, I want to kind of disentangle, like, is there a relationship between what those in greater Minnesota think about consistent sentences, for example, but I'll need to control for role. And with 77 responses, it's not like huge N, but I'm going to dig in for sure. Like, what we haven't done is sort of like a ton of correlational questions yet. We mostly were just looking at sort of descriptives, like what percent of the whole population answer these questions. But I'm going to dig in. I'm curious if role distinguishes your perspectives on these things, but I'll have to control for, or I should say, I'm curious if location has an impact on how you answer these questions, but I'll have to control for sector, because I think largely that greater Minnesota was probation. So we'll see if we can tease it out.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Other questions or curiosities as we continue?
Katie, I have a question. I don't know if you can really answer it, but I'm really pondering your findings on lack of knowledge and therefore necessarily lack of deterrence. I mean, I don't think you can be disturbed by something you don't know exists
Right.
about these mandatory minimums and I'm not advocating for something like this, but I know some states, 3 strikes and you're out. I think everybody knows about that, maybe just because it's such a catchy slogan. Is this a marketing problem, or is this a complexity issue, or is that even a question you could begin to answer?
Man, that's such a good question. Like, why didn't you know? Marketing complexity. I don't. Jeanette, you can chime in here if you remember from any of our. You did the bulk of the interviews and from our focus groups. I'm trying to think if we sort of dug in, like. I'm not sure, but I could explore that to see if like there was sort of feedback on whether or not and why people explain. Jeanette, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. I can chime in real quickly. So I guess I didn't necessarily like get into like how come like you hadn't heard of this, that type of questioning, but I did hear like unprompted one of my participants who identified I think as a family member did call for public education around this. Like he would like to like he himself he was both impacted, like he had served some time over controlled substance crimes, and he also had family members who had as well. And yeah, one of the things that he called for is there needs to be more public education. So starting in like middle school, high school, like teaching or like just warning kids about this, because like I know like we had like their programs and things like that, but like they don't really get into this kind of stuff. So yeah, I just thought it was interesting that he did call for like that sort of like education happening, like as kids like are in middle school, high school, and yeah, just warning them about like potential risks. But other than that, I can't. Yeah, I think that's the main one I remember.
Yeah, it's a good question. We can definitely dig in and see if there's anything there.
I would just editorialize it that I think a takeaway for the task force is that the simpler the policy, a policy that can be quickly communicated through a tagline, like 3 strikes. Not that I'm advocating 3 strikes, but something, the simpler, the more likely it is to be a deterrent, I suppose, because the simpler it is, the more easily it can be communicated. Any other questions?
And feel free, I'll throw my email in the chat. So if things pop up or you're like, could you just dig into the relationship between, role and like perspective on consistent sentences? Like if there's a particular question that you have, obviously we could like slice the data a lot of different ways. And like I said, 77 is much larger samples than we thought. So we may be able to see some differences between groups, but it's not huge. And so if folks have things they're really interested in, just let me know. But otherwise, Jeanette will be back in June. I'll be out of town for your meeting to sort of present our final findings, and we'll have a memo for Julie and folks at Wilder to incorporate too. So we appreciate you giving us the time.
Well, thank you very much. All right. Well, let's move on to subcommittee report outs for the committee chairs. Kelly, I think we know what's going on with stakeholder engagement. Anything else to add there?
No.
Okay. All right. Mark, do you have anything for us?
Nope, nothing since the last meeting.
Okay, sounds good. How about you, Rob?
I'm actually just finishing 2 things up, and I'm wondering if I can just pin it for a moment. I have just 2 little graphs that I wanted to show people, but I'm trying to clean them up. But other than that, I've been working with Julia I've been working with the Rabina Institute and to kind of get everything ready and ready to prepare for the next time we get together.
Okay, Rob, I'm just going to piggyback on a data point. One of the things that I wrote, I realized was kind of falsifiable, and that was, it had to do with the predatory offender registration policy and how the compliance rate seemed to be a big motivator for some of the policies of Katie's Law back in the day, and just sort of seeing how compliance rates changed over time. So I asked the predatory offender registration unit, if they had longitudinal data about client compliance rates with the predatory offender, the people's predatory offender registration requirements. And I just got a response yesterday, and two things that I would observe from, well, three preliminary observations. One is they said, I kind of rushed them because we had this meeting today, and they said, we're not 100% sure that this data is good right now, so don't advertise it, don't use it, and that sort of thing. So there's nothing I'm going to be presenting today. But the second point is it appears that their data set starts in 2004, which was obviously significantly after Katie's law. So I don't know if we're going to be able to come up with a good data point pre-2004 as far as what the compliance rate was back then. I know we have that press release from a representative who said it was pretty high at that time, but I don't know that we're going to be able to actually substantially validate that number that was on the press release, because it appears that the data that they can present starts in 2004. And I guess the third observation I would have, and this is just from eyeballing 23 spreadsheets, you know, without any kind of graphs or anything in them, and all broken up by, you know, 3 or 4 different risk levels and no risk level assigned. I don't really see a trend during the period of late 2004 to date. It's not obvious to me that there's like a break, like, wow, something really happened to improve the registration compliance rate. It looks to me like it's pretty, you know, kind of ups and downs, but there wasn't an obvious point of improvement. It looks like it was pretty high the whole time, honestly. So just to let you know that that's coming, but I think that is relevant data that once I get kind of the green light from the POR unit to share the data, I'll share it with you, Robert, and we'll go from there.
That sounds great. Thanks so much.
Okay, so all right, the main event here, discuss proposed recommendations. So I think this doesn't have a person on it, but I think our discussion was that Wilder was going to be leading us through this. Is that right, Julie?
Yes, and I
Okay.
can pull up the PowerPoint slides and I'll turn them off so we can talk, because we don't need to look at them the whole time, but that was the way I was going to do so. And hopefully everyone has the Word document that was sent out that accompanies the PowerPoint. So let me just get that up really quickly. Gonna let me start. There we go. Okay. So I will, so yes, our purpose today is just to review and discuss feedback and recommendations that have been shared so far. So we will save space for anyone who has already provided their feedback, and those are incorporated in these somewhat busy slides, at least for 60911. But again, supplementing that, the slides are the Word document, which we compiled by piecing together either conversations we had with you or emails we received from what you sent us or Dawn. The idea then is to also allow for other feedback and thoughts that might have come up after the rest of you have reviewed them, have had some chance to hear from others, or maybe those of you who have already submitted things want to add to it. So this is really just to discuss items, and then after this, we would be preparing something for June's meeting where we're going to be more, I guess, voting, if you will, what we're doing for our recommendations in the report that is due the middle of August. If we find something that we are all in agreement with, we can certainly consider doing that fist to 5 process that we did last month, just to kind of check one off, but we're not charged with making full decisions this month or anything, knowing that we still have other data coming, and you all may want to process and think about things that we talk about today. So again, this is very busy. I'm going to take it off in a minute and encourage people to either look at the document, the Word document, which has slightly more detail. This is the largest one. I wanted to also just mention that we wanted to give Shane and John and Mark and Nate and Amber a chance to just kind of go through anything, but we'll, I know specifically Shane, you might have wanted to add some, some verbal pieces to this just to give some context. So I will put it on stop and we'll be allowing people to kind of chat about that.
Well, I mean, I can talk a little bit about, I agreed primarily with what Nate proposed. I think that that's overall a really good structure. One thing that in terms of what else to do, there has been a real movement, and I saw that there's movement in the legislature towards increasing the clearance rate for non-fatal shootings. And there's also been additional publicity for what they've done in Ramsey for that. And philosophically, that's the same way that's what I'm pushing for too, is that there be a focus on people who actually shoot as opposed to mere possessors. And I think a combination of what Nate suggests plus a continuing mandatory for discharging a firearm in the course of a crime will create that. And what that does, among other things, and this ties into the discussion we just had with Katie, is it moves us away from something that's rooted in this false idea of deterrence, and instead is focused on incapacitation of those that we know are actually going to be the most dangerous.
Julie, can I just ask some clarifying questions?
Yes.
So, Mark, I acknowledge my bias. I put it out on the table. Sort of what I see as being a good path for that. Would your objectives be accomplished by adding onto what I've proposed to say, and if the firearm was discharged, then it's a presumptive commit and or a mandatory commit for the guidelines duration? Like, would that accomplish it, or are you looking for more time?
I think that would go a long ways towards accomplishing it. Yeah, if it was a mandatory guidelines duration, because usually when you have a discharge, you've got, relative to our guidelines, a fairly long commit anyways.
Right. Yeah, there are a couple of statutes that I can think of that have a provision in it that basically says that the defendant has to be committed for the grid time, the guidelines duration, basically.
Yeah. I know we've got those. I'd want to do a little bit of a survey and see what those, look at the grid, and but I do know that attempted murder is going to be a presumptive commit, and I think usually above 48 months. So that's substantive. I think too that I think that we have to do something that acknowledges the public safety part of it, and that incapacitation of people who are actual shooters, I think, is the most important thing we could do to promote public safety directly.
Any other questions for Mark?
All right, Shane, I won't put you on the spot, but I was going to see if you wanted to jump in and add your pieces to kind of this part of what we're talking about.
Okay, I'll try and hopefully it keeps it on point. It's certainly apparent I come from a different perspective, because from the crimes I'm seeing, that these are the things that we're talking about for public safety, and it does include the gun possession by people the legislature has identified as those that have increased in safety concerns. And I feel like that's being just disregarded here, that the possession itself of a weapon creates a heightened risk of harm. You don't just need to use it. When it's involved with drug crimes, it's used to protect your territory, your turf, your sales, and so forth. A person just having a weapon on them is a highly fearful thing for those encountering them. So that's why I felt that part should be kept. Questions I had when I looked at some of these issues that I haven't felt have been really examined in great detail is we've looked at and saw a departure rate that has been considered high, but we haven't dug into those numbers. You know, what go to the type of weapon? Are the high departure rates more driven by the type of weapon, knife or gun or other? On the gun crimes, is there a distinction made on use or possession do we see that in the data? How does geography play into part of this? I'm from the 8th, and at least the little data we've had sent, you'll see that we have some of the lowest departure rates among the judicial districts. In other words, we're following the guidelines. So it's been said that somehow the departure rates are a signal from the justice system that's not working. I guess I fundamentally disagree with that because it's built in. We have this gigantic one size fits all. We allow for a soft mandatory, which means we're asking the courts to look at case by case. But if we're seeing that there's also this geographic factor loading that, then we seriously need to consider if these high numbers are from the metro area, why is it that they're viewing this statute in these provisions differently than other locations? What's driving that? Are there any concerns for that? And of course, the various times, because the mandatory or 60911 does include a lot of offenses. That was being discussed. I was going through the list the other day, and there are a number of crimes that are in the presumptive commit lines. But then you also have offenses such as harassment. That's one of the crimes. Third-degree burglary is listed. There's escape from custody. And then there's a few others that are not typically in the commit to prison area. And how that affects the use of mandatories, I think, is questions we should be considering.
Sure. Kelly has a question for Shane.
Shane, I appreciate that input, and I'm hoping that Rob is taking some notes that they might be able to illuminate some of that with the data analysis they're doing. But I was wondering if you could actually walk through the proposal that you made, because I'm not 100% following it. And so I think it would be helpful if you could actually walk through the points so that I can get a better understanding of how you're suggesting we change this up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, let me start more with general principles and some of the things either are my beliefs or things we're seeing. One I think we're seeing is a one-size-fits-all problem. And the more an offense is linked to a mandatory, and the more kind of scenarios that go into that offense that exist, the greater degree of problem. Second degree assault's a good example of that. You can have shooting a gun, you can have brandishing a gun, you can have possessing a gun while committing the other crime. You can have use of other weapons like knives, box cutters, things that would be thought of as more dangerous. And then you can have other things like a billiard cue or baseball bat, or just kind of other weapons or devices that could be used in a dangerous manner. And then you have the penalties treating them differently. So you're trying to shove a lot of things into that. The POR statute is kind of the same way. You have your list of main crimes, but you also have circumstances surrounding that crime if that's what you're convicted of. So you cast the net broader. You also cast the net broader with not just residency, but cars and other data you got to supply. Should all that be treated the same? Okay, so that's one issue. Two is I felt like when we're seeing that the numbers do not link with the guideline sentences, meaning the guidelines have a lot of durations, 0 to 6. And it has seemed that when the penalties fit better within those guidelines, that it works better as a whole process. An example is after the drug reform laws, they used the guideline numbers to inform how they created the punishments versus, 1 year on the dangerous weapon, 3 years first time offense, 5, 3, 60 month always for the felon in possession charge, regardless of points. So I felt like the more we could account for that, account for the greater increase of criminal history, have a bigger effect on those instead of just once. Again, I'll use the felon in possession. That's a 60-month sentence, and that's whether you're at 0, whether you're at 6 points. And it's put in the grid at the top end is where the 60-month number is. So that creates its issues in handling those cases. Okay, and certainly I laid some of those out where, I do see gun violence and as a important public safety risk, that drugs are tied up with that. It just is. That's well known. So that's been concern of some of the proposals, is disconnecting that drugs and gun violence is connected. And I also was trying to take, where has the legislature set their policies, and take our cues from that. Okay. So the proposal was, with some of that in mind, is when we have the legislature set a 36-month starting point for a gun offense. And like was done when the DUI law was passed, making a 36-month felony, that was the starting point for that offense. So we should take our cue with that and treat the gun use and possession where the 36-month number shows up, and that is a severity level 7. When you increase it to 7, you're also driving down to about the points 4 or 5, where the 60 months, the 5-year mandatory comes into play. But you still leave room to punish those with greater criminal histories. So it's more reflective of someone with a higher criminal history score getting a larger penalty. And it fits more what's thought of as the appropriate location for that offense. The dangerous weapons, that's where I saw a lot of discrepancy in, at least the little data I've seen on it is, and I thought we needed to really break that apart. Substantial bodily harm has already been made as 7 or will be. And then segment that out by bodily harm or fear of bodily harm or some other metric. Because I know at least when I've prosecuted, or our office has, when you get down to the brandishing where you're showing the weapon but you're not near them, that's also like a threats of violence crime, which is a severity level 4, which is a state sentence. And that's how we resolve a lot of them. So a real focus on the the dangerous weapons issue and how we punish that crime. Increase of felon possession charge, put that on the 7. That's there you don't have the mandatory being just simply the max points. You account for points better by putting it there.
Sorry, can I ask you a quick question about that?
Yeah.
When you say, so that would mean, are you saying to remove the mandatory and then, or how, like, so you're saying it would be a severity level 7 and then it would just like be graduated along like with the points, like the points axis in the regular way?
No, I'm saying keep the mandatory because I still think it's I feel like it's assumption of many is that when you talk about that crime, you're not talking about like it's a serious public safety concern. To me, it's a very important public safety concern crime. So I think the mandatory should be for that kind of offense. So you keep the mandatory, but you're not treating those with the score of 0. You're reducing the impact on those with the higher score because we saw that the higher scores, you don't have much increase in penalty. And I'm saying they should. If you have a 6, you're not just getting the 60 months, you can get 72 is the center, 84 is the top of the box. At least for those with higher scores, get higher punishment. I'm not talking about removing the ability to, on the first offense, move to depart. And if one were to kind of do scenarios where do you reach 3 points, which is the standard presumptive commit on a severity level 7? There are very few scenarios where you have a second, going in on a second felon in possession charge where you're not already at 3 points. You either have had to have committed your crime a long time ago, so you don't have custody status, or you have almost no other offenses, given how it's scored in the system.
Shane, can I ask you, okay, so for number, I'm actually, if it's okay, I'd like to kind of go backwards a little bit. So I understand that for point number 4, you're saying that the currently ranked crime of felon in possession should move from a 6 to a 7. So you're recommending that we increase that ranking and then it would fall a little bit more in line with the mandatory minimum. If we go up to number 1, this is where I'm getting confused because you're talking about increasing use and possession of a gun to severity level 7. Are you talking there about the firearm mandatory minimum under 60911?
Yes.
So that one's not a currently ranked crime. It's a mandatory minimum that like overlays onto other crimes that you're being sentenced for. So are you talking about like actually making it its own ranked offense, or that's where I'm getting confused?
Okay, no, fair point. I mean, when I was thinking of that, the offense of second degree assault is what was in my head, which is a 6, make that part of it a 7. So I think this is where you see recommendations or ideas 1 and 8 come into play. Is you have what are 60911 crimes, and you have a number of them that are already, second degree murder, first degree murder, third degree murder, egg robbery. They're already in the commit to prison area, even with 0 points. So I guess think of number 1 as changing second degree assault to a 7 for clarity of idea. But
okay,
I think
so is it just that one, or are you thinking like any of the crimes that are listed should have the severity level changed? Or I'm just trying to.
Right. So let me say it this way, that 1 is for second degree assault where it's use or possession of a gun.
Yep. So if that's an element of the crime,
Right.
then you're saying that should be a 7 as opposed to a 6 where it is now.
6. Correct. And that's a high number of our 60911 crimes are
Yep.
that. Now but with that in mind, that's where the number 8 comes into play. And that's what I'm saying is you have a list of crimes there that are all over the severity level spectrum. And we haven't really talked about that list and how they're impacted. We had an example of where it was ag robbery, but for example, 3rd-degree burglary is on that list. So someone going into Walmart after business hours and they have a gun on something that's a severity level 4 triggers 60911. That raises different policy and safety concerns than some of the other crimes. And it's kind of digging into that issue, I think, we haven't done up to this point. And what you may have is potentially removing a few more crimes of the 60911 crimes as we kind of flush out which present the increased public safety concerns. And related to that was my remove 5th-degree drugs, the possession. That's our drug addict. That's the example brought up of how this could be unfair to have us mandatory impacted by that. I think just removing even that one offense would affect a great number of cases. So we're condensing the pool of who should be the public safety concern cases. Also, if you look at a different sentencing provision in the law, it's for violent offender sentencing. We've talked about 3 strikes and you're out kind of things. Minnesota doesn't quite have that, but they do have a provision that the state can seek an aggravating sentence up to the statutory maximum if someone's going to be convicted on their 3rd violent offense and they're facing an executed sentence. Within that definition of what a violent offense is, they include all the Chapter 152 crimes except 5th degree. So I'm saying keep those consistent. A 60911 definition and a violent offender definition in that provision would then mirror each other and be consistent policy. And it's also the ones that I've seen a number of firearm restoration requests is the person who has the old 5th degree possession charge, not the person who had the 1st degree, they possessed 117 grams of methamphetamine, asking for their gun back.
That was really helpful. I appreciate you drawing that out. I just wanted to thank you for that.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah, Mark.
Oh, who is it? Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, it's Mark Hazy.
Oh, okay.
I have a comment that's not particular to any of these ideas, but I wanted to just get it out there while it's fresh in my mind, and something that Shane said made me think of it. And it goes to this idea of uniformity, consistency across the state. And I've been part of these policy discussions before on similar issues like the use of stays of adjudication and how those vary from county to county on drug offenses in particular. And I've kind of changed my view on that a little bit. The fact that some counties follow these mandatories more than others, I'm not sure that's a terrible thing. I mean, when you think about it, every county attorney is elected by their constituency to do these things in the way that they want them to do. It's not that much different than, you cross the state line and you're going to be prosecuted a bit differently on something. And I also so the mandatories, at least the 60911, the 36 month is not really mandatory. People can depart, and they do often, and in this case they have to also report it, so there's there's a little more accountability for that for their community. I think the mandos, as we call them, are the ones that really are mandatories. And I don't personally agree that, it's a good idea for the legislature to develop a sentence from where they sit that just can't be deviated from. But if the people closest to the case can deviate and they have to report on it, I think that's, even if there may be differences from particular jurisdiction to jurisdiction, that might not be such a bad thing. So just a little bit of an editorial comment, something I've been thinking about as we look at this, because it's so easy to think that when we're talking about mandatory sentences, they really are mandatory, but a lot of these are not.
I guess if I could jump, or was somebody else going to talk? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to make a couple of comments. One is I wanted to share some of the data because Shane had discussed that, and I know this was a huge data dump that we did in January, but might bear some dwelling on. One is this doesn't necessarily directly deal with what Shane was talking about, but I think it's interesting to look at. Now, this is looking at the side of 6911 that's committing a listed offense with a weapon, not the other side, the felon in possession, automatic 5 years. But here you see what was that underlying offense, and most of the offenses are assault in the second degree. So it's like a total of. Let's see, what's the total number here? 1624 is our total number. And of those 1624, almost 1,100 of them are some version of assault in the second degree. So the vast majority of those offenses that we're seeing are assault in the second degree. It's 984 plus 106. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just one thing on that I think is masked and goes to my concern is that in that group, that huge group of assault twos, which you're right to highlight, there's people who shot the gun and people who didn't.
Right.
I think that's a big difference.
Well, and there's also, right. And I think we can, I feel like we're going through a process here where we're going to be able to disaggregate that assault in the second degree somewhat. Right. Now the commission's already done that a little bit because they are effective August 1st, unless the legislature intervenes. Assault in the second degree with a weapon and substantial bodily harm is going to be ranked at severity level 7. So it's going to go up a severity level. Whereas right now they're both ranked at severity level 6. So I think that's going to be a helpful distinction for sentencing authorities, but also in terms of, and Mark, if we were to incorporate your idea too, of like, there's sort of a higher level where things get stiffer and maybe, there's a prison commit and maybe it's a mandatory prison commit. Right. Kind of thing. If the weapon was actually discharged, I mean that to me is appealing because then with assault in the second degree, which is the lion's share of these, you've got a distinction between weapon discharged, weapon used in some other way without discharge, and then everything else. And to me that has some appeal.
And that's my point.
Yeah, because you're right. There's a lot. Again, I go back to I don't mean to, maybe I shouldn't downplay this, but, the case I had where the, wife is chasing the husband around the kitchen island with a butcher knife. And it's like, I don't think he was ever really in fear. I think he was just kind of, it was the sort of last encounter in a failing marriage. And, sure, it's a crime, but is that the same thing as somebody getting shot at? I don't think so. Just to point out the statistics, number 2 here is felony drug crime, and then number 3, you get to the robberies. And I'm sure most of those are aggravated robbery in the first degree if there was a weapon involved. But the other thing I wanted to point out here, and this is really the main reason I'm bringing this up in direct response to what Shane was asking, is we do have the breakdown here by whether the firearm was possessed, the firearm was used, or other dangerous weapon was used. And this isn't necessarily 100% accurate. This is according to the sentencing worksheet. So as the probation officer understood the facts of the case to be, you see there are very small number of the subsequents involved here, but You see, if firearm is possessed, you have a pretty high departure rate from the mandatory minimum. Whereas if the firearm is used, you have a smaller departure rate. And then if it's an other dangerous weapon used, you have a high departure rate again, more than half. So, and I think that, kind of bears out a potential distinction there between, the use of the firearm seems to be taken more seriously than either the possession of the firearm or the use of a dangerous weapon other than a firearm. And I'm just pointing this out to say we do have some data, and I recognize that it's, kind of hidden in plain sight just because there was so much data that was contained in this document that we presented in January. Shane, I do have a question for you though, and that has to do with some of the comments that you made in your written statement. Let me see if I can find that. All right. Sorry about this. I had it up, but I guess I don't. Oh, here it is. Okay, so you had a few points. One, I'm just going to read it here. One, link the mandatory penalties better to guidelines durations. Maybe I can put it in the chat. Oh, you got it up there? Okay, yeah, there it is. So link the mandatory penalties better to guidelines durations, increase penalties for greater criminal history so mandatory minimum does not impact all offenders in the same manner despite criminal histories, and reduce the one-size-fits-all approach. So those comments to me seem very friendly toward the proposal that I'm making, because I'm trying to, in my proposal, link the mandatory penalties better to the guidelines durations and increase penalties for greater criminal history scores so mandatory minimum does not impact all offenders in the same manner despite criminal history. So, I guess tell me why these aren't why aren't we agreeing? I feel like there's basic agreement here with these 2 points here. I'm trying to come up with a proposal that I'm open to tweaks, like Mark's ideas. Those sound great to me if that's what the task force is looking for. Isn't there some way we can work with something where we kind of throw it on the grid so that there's, a relationship between the punishment and the two things that the guidelines are concerned about, which is the severity of the offense and the criminal history score of the offender?
Probably that's rooted in the removal of or elimination of the mandatory minimum, which that's the part I don't agree with at all. And so I'm trying to still keep that element, but add in where do the numbers make more sense instead of just the one that's the most random is you use a dangerous weapon first time and it's a year. But the grid number is 21 when you have 0 points. So it just creates a mess that way where they don't work well together. So that's why I said increase, because it's either the second degree assault where you use a gun or felon in possession of a firearm. They're both 6s currently, and they both would have on a subsequent firearm 60-month sentence. The grid at 6 points is 57 months. 5, it's 51, even just tops off at 61. So you're already having a statutory penalty listed that's at the very far end of our grids. If you increase that crime or both of those crimes to a 7, 60 is the center number for severity level 4. So you're wetting the duration better with our current guideline numbers. And like I said, if you have higher points, they get punished more than just whether you're a first time felon in possession, or have an extensive criminal history. So I think that's I guess one answer to that is still, while keeping the mandatories, make them better fit with what the current guideline structures are. And 7 seemed to be the location where that fit the best that we could do. And I even found the idea that someone possessing a gun, this idea that it's an inherently risky activity, that by itself, like felony DUI, which is in that grid too, which someone could be in physical control. They could be sleeping it off on the side of the road. They're not driving, but that's a 7 because of the inherent risk of being in that position. And that's where I kind of saw the gun use.
I see Dr. Osler and Dr. Stewart and then Amber's hands up. So let's just start with the order I got it at Dr. Osler.
Okay, thanks. And my question is for Shane. First of all, I completely agree with you on an important fact, which is that, you know, drugs and guns often go together. Majority of cases in trafficking that I prosecuted, guy had at least one gun. The ones I supervised, I saw it in a plurality or a majority of the cases. So that's true. But what I don't get is how this mandatory minimum solves that problem, given that there's no evidence of deterrence. That, you know, that the fact that we still see that at the same levels tells me that this mandatory minimum isn't working to solve that problem.
I'm not looking at it as a deterrence issue. I'm looking at it as a punitive punishment issue. It's a high risky behavior. We're going to sanction that. And that's where I think a lot of the conversation here is focusing. If it doesn't do a deterrence job, it's not effective. It's not working. It's, you know, it's not what we should do. And that's not my position. It's a high risk behavior that we as society should have a higher punishment for. And that is going to be, I'm sure, at the root of a lot of the members' disagreements throughout all this is, should we focus on deterrence, rehabilitation, punishment, how the mixture works.
Shane, what do you think about you know, incapacitation versus punishment, which is, you know, what Mark Osler said earlier about, you know, on some of these really dangerous non-fatal shooting behaviors. Are those the same to you, or totally different?
Well, obviously, I mean that if it's fatal, it's worse because it has the worst outcome.
Yeah.
But in a sense, the act itself is the same. And you see, that's something that my community's been struggling with for years now, is where we have, whether you call them different gangs or just different groups or factions, have been using guns and shooting up neighborhoods. We just had one about a month ago, drive-by shooting kind of case. One of the offenders was a felon in possession, and we already had him charged with that. So we're seeing a lot of gun violence used where it's faction on faction. And that is where it is very helpful to have a gun possession charge, because these groups will not come into court and testify against each other. They will handle it themselves. So that's...
And gun possession is easier to prove.
Yes,
right?
And it helps address the public safety concern in a real meaningful way.
And if I could ask a question about the process, because I think that's part of the issue here is, you know, when a prosecutor charges and is negotiating, so you have better leverage if it's a mandatory versus, let's look at Nate's proposal, for example, if there was sort of a stronger, it was harder to deviate from the sentencing guidelines, if that makes sense. Does that question make sense to you?
No, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think, yeah, anytime you have a higher, whether it's higher punishment or it's a hard mandatory versus a soft mandatory, that does allow for negotiate, we have more leverage in the case. No different than, on the other side, when we have crim sex or domestics, we have, whether it's recanting victims who are, in trauma over the process, don't want to be involved in. Defense leverages that very effectively too. So, there with that punishment, yes, that certainly does allow for us to use it to it.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to understand that better, and I haven't had the experience prosecuting that you have, so I want to talk to our attorneys about that more too.
Thanks, Mark.
So-
Dr. Stewart.
Not an attorney. And so I guess what's not clear to me, like setting aside the numbers and the severities and the criminal history scores and like the rankings and all that, for the attorneys on the call or the people that, prosecute or defend or judge these cases, I guess what is unclear to me is the functional difference in the process between a mandatory, like a soft mandatory is that kind of exists now, and just the guidelines. You know what I'm saying? So like, that's what I'm not, that's not what, because a lot of the things that it sounds like a lot of the things in terms of that people have been, that I've been hearing different people say about accounting for local variation and allowing different locations to kind of do the things that they want to do and how they want to do it and whatnot. I guess I don't understand the difference. I guess, yeah, I don't know. If somebody can just explain to me the functional difference of, how this changes things, like how having a soft mandatory versus having it in the guidelines makes a difference. Because the way that I look at it is just based on, I'm thinking more about like the kind of the structural issue. And, I go back to not sentencing philosophy in terms of like the punishment philosophy,
Right.
but rather sentencing philosophy in terms of like how, the process and procedure and how that looks. And it's striking to me that we have two different approaches that are kind of merged into one. And so I'm thinking more about clarity. So if anybody could, Shane or, Amber or whoever does these cases, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that perspective.
Well, I liked one of the phrase that came up. That was last time by forgot exactly, was it Wilder? Anyway, put on a presentation describing the data, and they used the phrase legislative override. Where if you look at the grid, when you have 0 points, there are certain crimes that are just automatically presumptive commits. But you can have the ability to depart the substantial and compelling reasons. But it seems like there are these crimes that we're talking about with the soft mandatory that are within what is normally a state location, and the legislature say, no, we want to treat those like they're in the white area or the presumptive commit with even no history. So to me, that's all that does. It puts them as on the same level of those that are with no criminal history score. We say that they should send you to prison for that certain behavior. But just like those crimes, the judge is allowed to depart.
So just to clarify, so in other words, I mean, would it be functionally the same from your perspective for the guidelines to, if the part is removed out of the statute and put into the guidelines, and the guidelines say, in this kind of case, the ones that we're talking about with soft mandatories generally, in this kind of case, this is not a presumptive, this isn't the gray, this is in the white, right? Like, and I think there's other, like, I'm not an expert on the guidelines in Minnesota, but my understanding is there's some where it's like, if it's a, certain elements, it's like a presumptive prison rather than presumptive probation. Because I guess that's where I'm kind of like, is there something different between those two things? I mean, I guess other than that, we don't really have the power to make the guidelines make those,
Yeah.
The legal standard is the same, Rob. It's you have to articulate substantial and compelling reasons why in this particular case the either guidelines presumption or statutory mandatory minimum is not appropriate. So in all of these departable mandatory minimums, they use the exact same standard that's in the sentencing guidelines.
Yeah.
I will say as well, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I mean, truth serum, I do think it does give sort of a political avenue for people to, I would say, disingenuously argue that these judges are departing from these mandatory minimums. When the politicians who say that know darn good and well that there's this avenue for departure that they gave the judges in the statute that they didn't have to give them. So that may be the biggest reason for, you know, the biggest distinction between calling it a mandatory minimum and calling it a guidelines presumption is just you have that, you know, you can, it's something you can put in a mail drop or something for an election campaign. The other thing I just want to point out too is even with the mandatories, let's not deceive ourselves. We have data on almost all the drug mandatories are mandatories, right? So if you look at the data on drug departures, the only possibly not mandatory is the possession, the first degree possession one, and that, you know, even is mandatory unless certain criteria are met. And we still see, you know, it's not like it doesn't get departed from, you know, so a mandatory does not magically remove judges and prosecutors of their discretion to handle a case in their courtroom. Elected judges and prosecutors, I would add, to the discretion to handle a case in their courtroom as they see fit.
Amber, I saw you're up, and then Judge Harris, we can jump into you. I just want to let you know I see you.
Yeah, I was going to weigh in on how does it affect practically. I mean, it's a starting point. So if you have, you know, if you have a shaded area on the grid, you could walk in as a defendant, plead guilty, and the presumption is that you get probation. You might have jail time. If it's a mandatory, you walk in, plead guilty, and you're going to prison. So it's a starting point for negotiations. I think it also sets the practicality of where a sentence can or cannot go from the get-go. You know your fault. If you're asking for something that's, if it's a presumptive commit, a mandatory, you're trying to get not to go to prison. Maybe opposed to where if it's a presumptive or it's in the shaded area, maybe you're looking to see if you can get an amended count. I mean, it kind of is the framework of where you can and can't go negotiation wise, and how far you're asking, at least from my perspective, asking the prosecutor to come down, because that's where it starts. So I think practically that, I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it sets expectations from the get-go.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it does. And I guess it just gets to me, like, I guess functionally, is it different than, say, you know, some situation in which the guidelines has said, you know, generally speaking, this offense is a presumptive probation, but this offense with, you know, whatever X circumstance is a presumptive prison, right? Because it seems like you'd still have the same kind of hill to struggle over, in terms of, because if there's a modifier or something like that makes it into a presumptive prison, it seems like you would have the same kind of deal, that you'd have to come to the prosecutor and say, look, this is a presumptive prison, I would like to have this, have this be a probation or whatever. But maybe I'm wrong. That's what it seems unclear to me.
Well, it could affect the charging decision. I mean, it could be charged out in such a way, like a terroristic threat, but a second degree could be charged. They just didn't do it. And so that affects your position too, as to what your options are as a defendant. If you want to fight and go to trial, they could add the second degree count. So the qualifiers are baked into the statutes. And so if the more serious it is, if there's a weapon involved, it is baked into a lot of the actual statutes. Second degree is a little bit different because it does encompass a lot of different behaviors. I mean, it could be a car, it could be a knife, it could be a gun. So that one, but burglary or that sort of thing specifically has a firearm. if you use a firearm, then it's a more serious offense. And then that would be higher on the grid. Does that make sense? So I did want to weigh in on, and I don't know if this is the appropriate time or if I should let other people respond to what's being talked about now, but just about the inherent dangerousness of possessing a weapon that was talked about.
Amber, why don't
Any
you go
guide-
ahead, then we'll go to Judge Harris and then Mark.
Okay.
You.
I mean, I think we discussed it previously, but in situations where a gun is possessed in a second degree, I'm just going to say second degree, but any of those that aren't actually required for the charge, gun possession or gun use for the charge, I mean, if it were illegal for them to possess it, they would be charged with felon in possession. So it is criminalizing and putting a greater consequence on people who are simply legally possessing a firearm. And I have issue with that because people do possess firearms and handguns for self-defense. And I think there's a difference between possessing it and committing a crime and using it while committing a crime, especially if you are possessing it, because you can use it. I mean, it's right there. And if you don't use it, you don't get any benefit in not using it. There seems something that doesn't make sense to me, culpability and even public safety wise, because you're legally possessing, but you choose not to use, seems like something that shouldn't be giving you an extra consequence and putting you on the same level as someone who does take it out and use it to commit the crime.
Thanks for adding that, Amber. Judge Harris?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's, on a very basic level, there's kind of a two schools of thought here on the task force about what does it mean if there's a high departure rate on a particular type of offense. And from my standpoint, if departures are being granted almost routinely on a type of offense, that to me is indicative that the mandatory minimum is not working. And I've got two reasons for that. One is sort of philosophical and the other one is more pragmatic. The philosophical reason is if you're going to have sentencing guidelines and if you're going to have mandatory minimums, then they should reflect reality. And I realize there are geographic differences, and it sounds like some people are going to drill down a little deeper into why that might be. Judges only sentence what's charged and brought before them. So it might be that the charging decisions are weeding out some of those in different areas. I don't know the answer to that. But what I do know is I would like to see more of this incorporated into the sentencing guidelines and have that reflect the reality of the practice. So some of what Shane is proposing, I think, makes a great deal of sense. But if you do that, I don't think you need the mandatory minimum. And the second reason, the more pragmatic reason, is what Nate touched on, and I appreciate his comments on it. It is very, very easy to use this as a political hatchet. And I can say this now because I never have to run for anything again as long as I live, and I don't plan to. But there's not a lot of room for context and nuance in this stuff. And all somebody has to do is say, this judge is departing 60% of the time on this type of case. And that case is one of them that the data shows is routinely departed on. It is just, it's politics, not policy. And it is passing the buck. One of the things that used to be a source of frustration to me as a judge is if I had a prosecutor in front of me saying, it's our office policy never to agree to a departure on X type of case. All that's doing is passing the buck on the judge. And I don't think that that necessarily accomplishes the goals of public safety or the incapacitation that I think is legitimate on all of this. So I am in favor of trying to reduce the number of statutory mandatory minimums, incorporate this more into the sentencing grid to reflect the reality. And the reality is when somebody's got a higher criminal history score, they're a lot less likely to get a departure. And that's common sense, and it bears out with the data. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Harris. Mark?
Yeah, thanks. My thoughts are a little half baked on this, but some of this is starting to gel for me now. First, I just had a reaction to something Judge Harris said, which, the politics piece of it, and this goes back to, how Rob, you were saying that the difference between a mandatory and the sentencing grid gets a little murky, especially when it's not a mandatory. And something we may want to think about is like what we call whatever we're proposing to change, because like we could call a presumptive sentence with some additional requirements still a mandatory. That's just a side thought based on what the judge said. But and maybe this is I'm trying to understand better Nate's proposal too. But like, what if? And I don't expect any reactions to this at this point. I can put this in writing as well. But if we increased, and I think this is kind of what Nate's proposing, but you could increase the presumptive level in the sentencing guidelines. You could do it differently for possession versus use. You could go up 1 for possession in the course of one of these crimes. You could go up 2 for use. Make it a little more difficult to depart from the presumptive sentence. And that way it would be based on the underlying offense more than just whether a weapon was present or not. So you would have some more bargaining power as a prosecutor, especially if somebody was not a prohibited person in possession. But if they're a prohibited person in possession, which means, they're potentially pose more of a risk, especially if we got rid of something like, the lower 152 crimes and the crimes of violence. But you've also, as a prosecutor, you've got the felon in possession as something to, hang your negotiations on too. So, like I said, it's kind of half baked, but I may look deeper at what we've got so far and put something in writing. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. We had other, Amber, you might want to add to anything that was mentioned, but I wanted to leave it open for others to either ask for further clarification or add anything to the discussion.
Well, are we still discussing Shane's policy? Because I wanted to respond to what Mark said, but it's not really pertinent to Shane's, or maybe it is. I'll just throw it out there. I mean, I think sort of the general framework of what I'm proposing is adjustable, right? I mean, I think you could, for example, Mark, I think you could have a situation where maybe, if a firearm was possessed or another dangerous weapon was used, then you'd add 2 years to the stat max. And then if a firearm was actually used, you'd add 5 years to the stat max. And then if the firearm was discharged, then it'd be a presumptive commit and maybe a mandatory, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of ways to adjust that. The only caution I would throw out there goes back to the deterrence principle and the idea that if people don't understand it, and I go back to that chart that I did on my very first presentation at the end, where it talks about when 6 and 11 mandatories are mandatory and when they're not. And it's inscrutable. I challenge anybody to be able to recite that from memory. The more confusing it is, the more complicated it is, the less it's going to be understood, and the less it's going to be understood, the less of a deterrent it is. I think something that you can just tell somebody as they're, being sentenced, or, their probation officer can just tell them in 1 or 2 sentences, hey, if you commit one of these offenses with a gun, you're going away for an extra, whatever the guidelines say, an extra year or whatever the additional penalty is on the guidelines. And then people are like, oh, better not use a gun. And maybe they'll possess a gun. I mean, I appreciate Amber's point. Like, it's, I think some of these people in some of these areas where there's high crime, maybe it's more rational for them to be possessing firearms in self-defense than it would be for for me in Lakeville, where the only time I see cops drive by is, I don't know, I never see cops drive by. So it's, yeah.
I hear what you're saying, Nate, about the turn of, well, about the, I don't know, I guess a response I have to that is there is some inherent knowledge that the behavior you're engaging in is some behavior is more dangerous than others, right? And if what we're doing is tied more to the actual behavior, it's kind of an implicit, you know, we hope that people understand that discharging a firearm is more dangerous than just possessing one. And it also gets to the, you know, the punishment and incapacitation aspects as well.
I'm going to say this from the defense attorney's perspective and just the defendants, but I think that I do like the idea of having maybe even like you go up a level, a severity level on the grid for certain behaviors, like either possession or use or something like that. I think one thing that with mandatory minimums that's really hard with defendants is that it doesn't matter who they are, if this is their first time, if they, you know, have been crime free for 45 years, and it doesn't matter because they're just put in this box. But if you tie it to, it would more, I think, allow for a defendant to feel like an individual instead of their crime, because essentially they are their crime and that's it. It doesn't matter anything else when it comes to mandatory minimums. But if people have been in the, you know, have a criminal history score, it would bump them up 1 or 2 levels. It would be a commit for some of them, maybe depending on how serious the underlying offense. Maybe a first time offense would be a presumptive commit, but it would allow for there to be the ability to maybe even just take ownership of their actions. I know that sounds kind of weird, but people know where they're at. You know, if they have a criminal history, they know that if they commit another felony, they're gonna have more serious consequences. Whereas someone who's a first timer in the system, they don't necessarily have that perspective. And I think feel like they're treated unfairly when they're stuck right off the bat in that mandatory minimum. And I don't know how that affects their life going forward, but I think feeling, even if you don't agree with it, but you feel like you're treated fairly in the system, does matter going forward in life to these people.
If I can just
Kind of
jump
like
in
the
too.
step system.
I also think it recognizes another practical reality, which is, you know, Blakely, by and large, forms an upper limit on these things. And so getting it at a higher level of offense gives the judges a little more discretion to go higher as well. You know, I think I've said this before. In 15 years, I never did a Blakely hearing. It was obviously something that drove a lot of charging and plea negotiation decisions by the prosecutors, that they did not want to have that extra step and create the additional appeals issue and everything else to depart upward from the guidelines. So getting it into a larger spectrum anyway, I think makes a lot of sense, both for downward as well as for upward.
Mark, your hand's up. I don't know if it was still up from before or if you have anything else to add. Okay.
Just from before, thanks.
Okay, sure.
If I could ask a quick question, I am so for a data question, I am looking at it as for the prohibited person in possession of a firearm after a crime of violence. Question, I'm wondering if I want to be able to capture all these cases to kind of look at like the time crime free and how the length crime, like how long a person is crime free, and then their like propensity to either have a new crime of violence or a new felon in possession. case. But if you have a case in which a person, maybe this is more for prosecutors here, but if you have a case in which there is a person who has a prior crime of violence, so they would be subject to the prohibited person in possession of a firearm after a crime of violence, and they have a new case that has a gun involved, would it be consistent that in addition to whatever, like it's an assault or whatever the charges would be, would it be consistent that there would also be a charge for prohibited person in possession of a firearm? My question is basically, I'm trying to basically create a timeline from when a person's in the community after being released from a prior case, and then I'm trying to find what is the end of that clock if the end of that clock is a new crime of violence, and the crime of violence includes a firearm, so they clearly are a possession of a firearm that they're not supposed to have. Will that almost always be charged, or is that kind of hit or miss? Like in addition to like the assault or whatever the other new crime of violence would be. I'm sorry if that's not clear, because I don't think people understand this.
Like,
I would
I
say
guess
yes.
we've always charged it. Sorry
Yeah.
about that. Because a crime of violence would be, it's a lifetime ban. So, and if they're committing a new crime with it, we're going to charge both of them.
Okay.
If it's a non-crime of violence, probation, once they're done with probation, they can't even be charged with a gross misdemeanor, even if they had they were on probation for a felony. So.
Okay. So if a person is convicted of like say an assault with a gun, and then they go to prison, they get out, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, they have another case, and this new case is maybe an assault, and there's a gun involved, you would also charge the gun, like as a separate, like the possession, like you're not supposed to have the gun, you have the gun, right?
Yeah, we charge both of them, and they both can be under statute sentenced independently.
Okay. No, totally. I'm just trying to
Lindsay-
find. I just don't want to undercount the number of people is what I'm trying to say. So
But for other kinds of crimes, Rob, I mean, I know in Hennepin, first and murder 1 and 2, usually those would stand alone, and so you're not going to charge the gun possession. Although, in some instances they might if they think they need that backup because it's a weak case. But if you've got a strong second-degree murder, especially one that's coming in on a plea, you're just going to let that stand on its own.
And that was going to be my point. I mean, the felon in possession is an easy charge. So it's often charged out because if there's problems with the first charge, you likely have a case and can get a conviction on the felon in possession.
Okay.
So it would have to be, I guess, piggybacking that 60 months, depending on how serious the crime above it is, would depend on if the 60 months is worth charging out or not.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually really helpful. Essentially what I'm trying to say is, like, if we have a person that goes 10 years without a new crime of violence and without a gun case, I want to be able to pick that person up in terms of, you'll see what I'm saying when I present these data. But but what I'll do is I'll just include all new crimes of violence and then any charges of possession of a firearm, even if they're dismissed or whatever, just because the numbers are actually pretty small, so it's not that big of a deal. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Well, and sorry, related to that, so I'll be presenting some stuff on this probably next time because I think we're close to time. And so I think I'll coordinate with Julia and I guess Nate and Julie and everybody. So I'll have quite a bit of data. And then in terms of the stuff that Nate brought or that Shane brought up, I have a bunch of notes on the particular questions about like the guideline, like the driving and the departure rates. I don't know the getting into the different types of weapons thing. That might be really, that would probably be really hard to try to understand departure patterns, just because that's not always necessarily listed. But then like in charging documents and things. But I have some of the other stuff about geography and whatnot. So I'm gonna be diligently working this next couple of weeks to put some things together and try to present some data, because I think a lot of the questions that we talked about today, there's potential important empirical bases to this, and so I will do my best to make it not as wonky as possible.
Thanks, Rob. I'm looking at the time here. We're close to 11, and I know that it's probably as clear as mud, and there's, although a lot clearer, we have a lot of things to think about. I was going to ask Nate and Kelly how you want, we have 2 more kind of areas to go over. And I just wanted to see how you wanted to handle those times. I know, Nate, you might have other things that you want to go over with your memo too. So I just don't want to cut anything short, but want to be aware of time and maybe a need for a quick break if you so choose.
I'd like to keep going. I don't know. I mean, it's, I went and grabbed a cup of water just now, so I'm sure everybody's free to do that if they like, especially the remote people, but I'd prefer to keep rolling. And as far as my presentation, I mean, I feel like I presented last month, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. Other than that, I mean, obviously I fleshed things out in more detail. Mark, I appreciate that request last month, and it was good to get things down on paper. And I did have an addendum to that. So if you only read the first version, the addendum, or I guess the correct term is corrigendum, but it had a, I realized that drive-by shooting, second-degree murder involving drive-by shooting is in the same category logically as drive-by shooting itself, which is that a firearm was necessarily discharged. So therefore a firearm was used. So therefore it would be double punishment to give it an additional 5 years. So I removed it from that. And I do note that the commission has ranked that higher than felony murder. So it makes sense to, avoid double punishment in that case, because the commission's already taken care of that with ranking, which is sort of the general concept of having that excluded from the 5 year. Although it still would get the 5 years if the firearm was possessed, contrary to, after having been convicted of a crime of violence. So you still get that 5 years for those. But yeah, if anybody has any questions about how that works or anything like that, I'd be happy to answer that. Otherwise, Julie, I think we should probably cover, I mean, I think 60911 is really the most important piece that we're doing. So I'd really like to hear everybody's voices on that, the people who wrote in, but anybody else who would like to make comments. I don't know if we want to go round robin, especially for those who haven't spoken up, but, I'd love to hear everybody's voices and opinions on that. And, if I need to go back to the drawing board and add some things, I'd be delighted to do that. It really my goal here, I think I've been pretty clear about this, is to get a consensus package. So if there's some changes that we could make that would bring people on board who wouldn't otherwise be on board and wouldn't kick people off who would have been on board, then I'm happy to make those changes. Really, that's my primary goal is consensus, because I think, certainly we can just go with a majority rules kind of approach, but I think it'll be most useful to the legislature if we can present a consensus package to them. So I guess with that, Julie, why don't you walk us through the additional voices that we heard on the 60911 issues?
Sure. I saw Ashley, you take your went off camera or back on camera. So here we go. Here are the 60911. So we still have John's, we just numbered them. So in case it was easier to reference them between the Word document and this slide, they should match.
Yeah, and just to be clear, John's first point there, that's numbered 9, that's the one I was talking about. So great minds think alike. I identified that independently as being a problem logically. So I did add drive-by shooting, second-degree murder to the clause 3 or whatever it's called on that list. So it only gets the extra 5 years in way of thinking if the firearm that was used in the drive-by shooting murder was possessed by somebody who had a prior crime of violence conviction.
That's my other point. I don't know if my other point actually goes under 609.11 if we want to just table it for now, but I know early on we had talked about looking at 624-713, the felon in possession statute. And this was just about reducing the penalty for separating out possession of ammunition from possession of a firearm. We have, and I'm sure will continue to debate in this about whether or not possession of a firearm alone increases risk to public safety. But I think, excuse me, possession of ammunition alone is in a different boat entirely, but it's currently treated the same. And I sort of walked through some of my rationale for wanting to reduce that penalty. But again, I don't know if it goes to the mandatory minimum debate that we're having right now, or if it maybe goes more with that crimes of violence list and talking about chapter 624, but that was what I was getting at with that point. So.
Thanks, Sean. Judge Harris?
Yeah, I was just going to voice my agreement with that. I did see some cases charged where somebody had 1 round of ammunition in the trunk of a car, and and the departure is going to be granted in a case like that. But I do think that that's a logical inconsistency in the statute itself. I would support trying to break out the ammunition from the firearm.
And I would just say that the only extent to which my proposal addresses that is to say that because, the mandatory, not that mandatory minimum, but the penalty increase would be triggered by, maybe triggered is the wrong word here, but the penalty increase would be triggered by the use of a firearm in the commission of a listed offense by someone who's prohibited. So that would get you the extra 5 years, and that solves the bullet problem, I guess, because at least it wouldn't, the penalty increase wouldn't be invoked. But yeah, it's still ranked as a severity level 6 offense by the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. And, one way to solve that, I suppose, would be if it were separately statutorily enumerated, so the commission then would have the option of ranking the two separately. But right now it just says firearm and ammunition, so it's pretty tricky. I'm not saying it's never happened, but it's pretty tricky for the Sentencing Guidelines Commission in those cases to rank two things that are just lumped together separately. Kind of like assault. Like the definition of assault is, assault resulting in bodily harm, or assault by attempt, or assault by fear. And so because they're all lumped together, it's pretty tricky for the commission to rank those separately.
There are questions or feedback or additions? In terms of, and of course, we'll check with the chair and vice chair about this, but our plan would then be for June to summarize these and kind of pull them up so that there is a spot for us to, you as a group, to make decisions and maybe get to consensus. But I think from what I can tell that there's probably just you'll still have time to think through these as they've been presented today. And then we at Wilder would kind of sum things up for the discussion and get it out before the June meeting so that you can kind of ponder on those two. But again, we'll check with the chair and vice chair now, but when we do our debrief too, if something else comes up.
I mean, weren't there a couple of other people who had written comments that I thought we were going to hear from everybody who had written comments, but maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, I thought we have. Let me go back to this. All comments.
Yeah, well, like I think Ashley had made comments, and I guess, Mark, we heard from you. No. Oh,
I did not make comments, and I guess I'm judiciously using my voice. To be honest, um, I am probably not as in the weeds in this stuff as in this particular conversation as you all are. I guess how I'm kind of approaching this right now is just based on, I think, the stakeholder input and the presentation that we had at our last call. I guess I want to respect the voices here who have said that mandatory minimums are beneficial. I guess I just haven't really seen a lot of evidence that are saying that they're really positively impacting our communities. And so I guess as I'm participating and listening in this conversation, like, I think where I would hope that this group would do is to eliminate as much to a degree possible mandatory minimums, while understanding that it would be probably a big shock to our state if we were to eliminate them all. So I'm maybe not as in the weeds in this conversation, because I don't have as much intelligent things to add, but I guess that's just kind of where I'm sitting. So.
Thanks, Ashley.
Amber?
I can address, the one thing that I didn't talk about is the accomplice liability, but that was working within the framework of what we were presented. And thinking about, I think use and maybe even possession of accomplice of someone who uses a firearm would make sense. I have a little, like I said there, the fact specific part of it, I think could get really difficult practice wise, in like trying to prove that they somehow help them get it, or I just think that could be a difficult task and create problems. But so if we were to go this route, I would simplify it more, I think, to make it not only easier to deal with as a practitioner, but also culpability wise. I think it could be difficult to prove with, and probably you'd need Blakely on that too.
Yeah, I mean, just as far as Blakely goes, I mean, I feel like all these things would just be elements of the crime. I mean, if you want to have this enhancement, you just have to prove it up. I mean, I suppose you could look at that as Blakely, but I mean, it's just something that would have to be proven.
My understanding was that you would not, if the principal actor used a firearm, it wouldn't necessarily put an accomplice into the second Mando. Am I wrong in understanding how it was presented?
No, you're right. So thank you for bringing that up, Amber. So I guess my sort of sensibility or sense of justice is it's not fair to sort of hold a defendant strictly liable for the possession of somebody else's firearm that defendant may not have even known about. And yet that's how it is right now. It's sort of I think strict liability. It's not strict liability for the crime, right? I mean, they have to be accomplices to the crime. They have to be working together, and that's fine. That the defendant would be, liable for an accomplice's crime, assuming the requirements of accomplice liability have been met. But I guess one of my concerns with 6911 in this regard is that it is sort of strict liability in the sense that if you have an accomplice who has a firearm, even if you had no idea that that somebody was bringing a firearm to this particular crime, that accomplice gets the enhanced penalty for the other accomplice's firearm possession, which seems unfair to me. It seems like there ought to be some kind of um, um, culpability with respect to the firearm possession to do that. So basically, the way I've written it up is it basically takes the accomplice liability factors and applies them to the firearm use and says if the defendant aided, abetted, counseled, conspired, procured the firearm use, as well as having done that with respect to the crime itself, then it's fair to assign accomplice liability. That's my instinct, but I mean, it certainly would be simpler to just have the strict liability standard. It just doesn't seem as fair to me.
Well, and I agree with your premise. I don't know. I think I'm trying to practically think how you could apply it, I guess, is where I'm at with it. I think it could be difficult to do that. To give the, I guess I should qualify that. I think it'd be difficult to make them accountable without the strict liability. I think it would get into the weeds and evidence and how it might be obvious in some cases, but it could be very difficult in others to try to put that liability on the accomplice. If, like, for instance, if you are a drug deal and there's 3 people in a vehicle, one person leaves the vehicle, goes into the other vehicle and ends up robbing them with a gun. Necessarily the people who stayed in the suspect vehicle, who could be accomplices to the robbery, might not know that it was going to happen with a gun. But there's kind of a lot of, I don't know, it gets sticky there. If you know, whereas where it's at right now, they would just have that strict liability, whether or not they knew that they had the gun. So I just am trying to figure out how you could still have some liability, but make it make sense practically on how you could prove it. And I don't know if I get what you were trying to do here. I just think it could be hard to do.
Sure. I mean, one thing I'm thinking of as you're talking is you could just reduce it down to a knowledge requirement. Just say if you were aware of an accomplice's use of the firearm prior to the, or you
that
were
might be
aware
easier.
of the accomplice's possession of the firearm, then kind of in for a penny, in for a pound. Like you don't have to actually have aided in the use of the firearm. You just mere knowledge is enough, and at least that would
you knew it was going to be part of the crime.
Yeah, if you were going into the crime knowing that, maybe that's sufficient culpability. That at least gets rid of the unwitting accomplice problem. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Just a suggestion on that. If we look at how the proposed statutory language is on subdivision 3A, 1 and 2 basically just break down the aiding and abetting statute, where it's aids the accomplice in using the firearm, and 2 is advised, hired, counseled, or conspired with the accomplice to use the firearm. The aiding and abetting statute is intentionally aids, advises, hires, counsels, or conspires with, or otherwise procures the other to commit the crime. So I mean, maybe if we combined 1 and 2, then sort of via case law, we know you prove that if you knew someone was going to intend or was going to commit the crime and then intended by your aiding, hiring to further that, it would sort of be the same thing. You knew that they were going to use the firearm and intended by your actions to use it. If we sort of make the statutory language similar, courts might look at it that way as interpreting it the same way. So just one idea.
One thing I'm wondering is, would it be helpful if I were to sort of bring to the June meeting some of the things that have been discussed in this meeting as sort of like options, different language sets where maybe we do look at treating discharge more seriously, or have possession, basically just gin it up so there's different options, kind of like Lego blocks where you could plug and play different things and then discuss that. Would that be useful to the group? I mean, and part of the reason I'm saying this is it seems like and maybe I'm, this is egocentric of me, but it seems like people are, for the most part, are like the idea of tying this more to criminal history and offense severity, which we do by kind of moving it to the guidelines, but maybe look at different options on exactly how that's implemented. Would that be useful if I did that for the June meeting? John's nodding his head. Rob's nodding his head. Mark's giving me a thumbs up.
So I do think that we've heard some new ideas today of how to do this. And I do think we need to like sort of put them side by side so that we can have a better understanding of where we want to land. But we might need we might need both. And like, we might need like the high level, here are the ideas next to each other at a high level. And then maybe different language, that sort of, it's a lot of work. So like, I would be happy even with just the high level ideas and we get agreement on that. And then we say, okay, how would that look in the language at even the subsequent meeting if we have time for that. But for me, I think I need to see the high level, what's the difference, and boil it down to something easier to understand than like getting into the weeds of the actual statutory language. And that's my suggestion.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess the way I would approach that, so the document that I sent out has various decision points. And I think basically I'd just be adding decision points. So there'd be, no? Okay. I mean, but I mean, I think there are some other issues that I kind of glossed over on my document, additional decision points that probably need to be made. Okay. Any other guidance for me on how to do this? Okay. So I know we're going to be talking about June agenda items and next meeting dates. So you see we only have 3 meeting dates. Our current August 14th meeting date is a conflict for at least 2 of us here. So we're looking at changing that, and there was a poll that was sent out to see if you could handle some additional meeting dates. I want to just kind of be upfront with you. I've been on task forces where sort of the end of it, and this is really probably due to how limited time those task forces had, but the end of it, there's discussion and votes by the group, but then really the chair kind of baked the cake, right? I mean, everything was finalized without the input of the task force itself. And I really don't want to do that. I think I really want this to be an open process and not something that's sort of done after the fact. So I definitely want what we vote on in August to be final or other than, typographical and stylistic corrections. I want the substance to be decided by the task force, not just by 1 or 2 people after the fact. So that's my intent for the August meeting, is that we actually are finalizing language, which only gives us a couple of meetings here to do that with. So, and I guess that's another reason for wanting to get the language on the table as soon as possible. Any comments on that? Julie, why don't you discuss sort of your vision for June agenda items and reviewing the timeline and work plan in that regard? I think we're at that point, right? We're at agenda item 6, or was there more on 5 that you had us? I don't want to rush through 5.
I mean, we have these other ideas that we were going to do regarding 243 and chapter 152. I don't think.
Yeah, that's true. Well, we have time for it, so let's do that.
So we'll start with 152. And John, thanks for noting that that had these on maybe different sheets, but just wanted to give people again time to kind of discuss anything that we haven't already discussed, knowing that some of these might have been talked about already, and then also leave space for anyone else who has additions or wants clarification for now or for June.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I did make a change from what I presented in the April meeting. I was going to have, I think, aggravated first degree controlled substance crime, and I think I realized that that's too narrow and too broad, and that really, if we're going to be consistent and actually make these crimes of violence, which is what the list is called and what the list is, other than the Chapter 152 inclusion, that you really should look at those Chapter 152 crimes that have some kind of element of violence, and those are some very specific first and second degree crimes that involve the use of a firearm, and again, this is actual use of the firearm is required. It's not mere possession. This was a change that was made in 2016 where the and this is kind of my impetus from a recent legislative signal that they view use of a firearm as being more serious than mere possession from in the 2016 law. So if the drug crime involves the use of a firearm, then I think it's fair to call it a violent crime, a crime of violence. So it's fair to keep it on the list. And if it doesn't, then it's not. So that's my current suggestion, is to limit the crime of violence list to only those crimes that have as an element the use of a firearm. And then the person would be subject to the ban, the firearm possession ban for life under the current law. But I'm also proposing to have a crime-free off-ramp.
Rob, I don't know if your hand's still up.
I do have as like a little bit of a potential preview related to what I was saying earlier. I could show if it's helpful, at least related to this issue of the off ramp that you described, the 10-year off ramp. I don't know if that would be helpful.
Great. You can share.
Share. Okay. Wait, I don't want to share all these things. Hold on. Okay, can you see this graph?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is called this is basically called a Kaplan-Meier. Essentially, what this is so Nate had suggested a couple weeks ago, or the last meeting or something, had brought up this idea of an off ramp as it relates to the lifetime ban for firearms following a crime of violence. And so what this does is essentially says, okay, from the starting point, so point 0 down in this, like down, oh God, I don't know. So from point 0, that is following the conviction of a crime of violence, right? Based on the statute, or like the different subsections. So following the end of a crime of violence conviction after the person was released. So the person is not in prison, right? And the time from 0 to the x-axis is the years since completion without a failure. Now, failure is defined as either a new crime of violence or a felon in possession of a firearm, like, any charge of felon in possession of a firearm, regardless of the outcome. So if it was charged and dismissed, or if it was charged and convicted, I'm using sentencing guidelines data and more detailed data from the state court administrator's office. The time span here is from 1990. Basically, it's releases of people from 1994 through 2024. And so what's important to look at here is the differences between the red and the blue is the blue counts each time a person is released. The red removes the person. So just focus on the blue because that's the thing I think we care about. So essentially it's saying, okay, if a person is released, can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay. So when the person is released, that's time 0. What is the kind of propensity of that person to be convicted of or to be charged with a new crime of violence or felon in possession of a firearm? And so basically what you can kind of see is that like most of the work or most of the failures happen. Oops. I've never done this on Google Drive like this. Most of the failures happen within the first, 5 years. And I think this is like consistent with what you would expect, right? Most people after they're released, generally speaking, criminology would tell us that criminological research would suggest that the highest likelihood that someone is going to commit a new offense is going to be within the first couple of years. I mean, primarily within the first, year or two, and then it kind of starts to even out here over time. And so then I put in a couple markers here for 10 years crime-free, and then 15. When I say crime-free, I mean crime of violence free and possession of a firearm free. So 10 years here and then 15 years here. And essentially what we see is that basically once you get down to 10 years, just the likelihood of these people, the likelihood that they're going to, get another case or get another charge is pretty low. And then after about 15 years, it's like pretty flatline. I mean, it's a pretty, what I would suggest is a pretty dramatic drop off. Now, you might be thinking, hey, oops, that's the wrong thing. You might be thinking, hey, what about the different types of offenses? And I think this is also useful based on the Chapter 152 stuff that we've been talking about. And it might not surprise people to know that kind of general violent crimes and robbery, kidnapping kind of have the biggest likelihood or the quickest drop off. People, robbery, it has lots of cases and whatever, and it's also just people convicted of robbery cases seem to catch more cases later on. But you also see some of that with drug cases. Again, a new crime of violence counts a drug case, right? So that would be one crime. If you have so we're looking at recidivism essentially for people with with these different things. But essentially, the point of what this is, and I can improve the presentation of this next time. But essentially, it's just saying like once we get to 10 years, especially once we get to 15 years, we are really looking at a very, very minimal risk in terms of the overall the proportion of those people who make it 10 to 15 years, the proportion of those people to commit a new crime of violence or be convicted of a felon in possession of a firearm is very, very small. And so I just wanted to provide that just as additional, just for some, context. I just kind of hacked this up a little bit ago. I mean, I made that change that we talked about with including all the crimes of violence as well. So I just wanted to show that. And then, if I can add more clarity to this, that could be helpful. Otherwise, there's a kind of a handful of other things I was planning to present, but I just wanted to bring that to the group. And I can tell everybody's thrilled to see graphs.
So historically, before the lifetime ban, it was a 10-year period. Well, actually, it was written in a confusing way, but I think that the intent of the statute was a 10-year period without a crime of violence. But the proposal that I put out there is even tighter than that. It's actually you have to have a 10-year period with no criminal convictions at all. So any crime driving after suspension, any kind of crime conviction would disqualify you from, well, it would reset the clock. So
Okay.
you would then have to be 10 more years crime-free from your release from confinement or from your conviction date if there was no confinement, until you'd by right reacquire the firearm possession right.
So this would be misdemeanor now.
That's my intent. Yeah. So petty misdemeanors would not count. They're not crimes, but any criminal conviction.
Okay, I can make that change. And what I will suggest is that what I will speculate is that you're going to see a much bigger drop in this. You're going to see a much bigger drop in this front end part, and then this is going to get a lot flatter on the other end. Because you're going to be pulling a lot of people out by the time you get to this later part. But I will make that adjustment, and I think that makes sense as well. So, hopefully,
yeah, and I'm trying to be very conservative here with it. I mean, the idea is that we're trying to get people who are pretty clearly about as safe as anybody else. So obviously you can't guarantee somebody's not going to be committing new crimes, but I think the idea is there's got to be something better than lifetime, right? I mean, there's no, what's the point in expending public safety resources pursuing people for the rest of their life, like Jean Valjean or something? It's at some point we've got to say, hey, isn't there evidence of rehabilitation? And there is a process right now for getting gun rights back, but it is totally in the discretion of the judge. And the idea here is not to remove that process, but to also add an off ramp that you, the defendant, have control over. Right? You can say, I'm going to be crime free for 10 years, and I'm going to get my gun rights back, and I'm going to be hunting with my grandkids. So that's the idea.
Sounds good.
I'll pull that up again to see if there's any other thoughts, additions.
And just to be clear, my comment on this was about the mandatory minimums in first and second degree drug, and not I agree with all the rest, but I think it's just a different idea. So.
Thanks, John. Amber, I saw your hand.
I was just gonna chat about the automatic 10-year. I do agree with that, and I like that it's not something that someone has to take an action on, because that is reserved for certain types of people who can afford it, people who know how to do it, or it can hire an attorney. And it kind of feels like the automatic expungement statute for like certain, if you meet these criteria, this will just happen for you. You don't have to go out and do it. And I think that seems like equity wise is a good way to approach it.
Thanks. I can move to our last slide here. Hopefully they're all on the right spot. To give people an opportunity to add any feedback, additions, edits, at least for right now.
I just have a comment, not to muddy the weeds, but I was just thinking of this as I was looking at the data from the POR unit that I got yesterday, and that is that there are 4 categories of registrant. I think there was another category earlier, but that seems to have dropped off the data, so I'm not sure what that is. But basically, you have people who are assigned risk level 1, risk level 2, risk level 3, and who are not assigned a risk level. And it seems to me like it might be a rational choice to retain the mandatory minimum for, you say, risk level 1. Honestly, I don't know the differences between the risk levels. I think you get assigned a risk level upon release from prison. Is that right? So, and is everybody assigned a risk level, or are some people not assigned a risk level upon release from prison?
I believe everybody who's released from prison is. Those who don't go to prison are not.
Okay, so maybe to say, so it seems like the people with risk level 3 and the people who don't have a risk level assigned, because I'm assuming that means they didn't go to prison at all. Maybe those are the people who benefit from the change, but we keep the mandatory minimum for people with risk levels 1 and 2. To me, that seems.
It's the other order. 3 is the high.
3 is the high. Oh, my bad. Okay, this shows how little I know about this, but okay, 3 is the high. Okay, so maybe keep it for 2 and 3, and not for 1 and unassigned. But of course they would still have the mandatory minimum for the second offense. I don't know. Is that something that's interesting to people? Would that be an improvement over the current proposal? John's shaking his head no. I don't mean to muddy the waters, but I'm just, trying to make this as fair as possible.
I would want to see the data.
Okay. The data, yeah, and I don't know that we would have the data from a sentencing perspective, but we should have the data from the POR data does indicate sort of what the current non-compliance rate is by risk level, so that might be helpful. Although I suppose it's probable that the people at the higher risk levels are more closely supervised, so they may have higher compliance rates anyway, but I don't.
On ISR for
They would be subjected to the conditional release period or
Yeah.
the supervised release period.
Yeah, John, do you want to just?
I was just saying that people who are level 3 are already automatically on intensive supervised release for as long as they're on release. And I think someone just chimed in that also they get that 10-year conditional release period in addition to whatever supervised release. So I know there is already an added penalty for level 3s.
And they can basically be punished without due process, essentially, right? If they can just be brought in.
No, the Department of Corrections provides due process
Okay.
for
All right, sorry.
all releasees.
Yes.
But without a court hearing.
Yes.
Without
If
a court hearing.
if they
have
violated it,
hearings.
they
We
would
have
still have
hearings.
hearings with the
Yeah,
hearings that release unit.
sure.
Nate, is that person level information data or is it aggregated?
It's all aggregated, yeah. It's just by month, and by the 3 categories.
Do they have person level data?
I don't know. They actually gave me more data than I asked for. I just asked for the overall non-compliance rate over time, and they gave me 22 spreadsheets for 22 years of data going back to the fall of 2004, and basically what the month by month compliance rate was for the 4 different categories. And then category D, whatever that was, that doesn't seem to exist anymore.
Is that something you can share or?
They said it's preliminary, so they kind of gave me an advance copy. So I'm not supposed to share it, but I guess I could share it with you under the same understanding that it's preliminary and not to be further disseminated.
Sure. I was just thinking, in terms of incorporating, if if it's helpful to incorporate in some of the stuff we talk about next time.
I just want to comment, like, I'm not opposed to thinking about this, but I just want to put out there that, so the POR registration level is really about community notification. So, and I mean, it ties to risk in that the people who are higher risk or, seen as higher risk to reoffend have greater community notification requirements. So level 3, you actually have that meeting with law enforcement and the community to, whenever a person is moving into the neighborhood. Level 2s and 1s don't have that same type of notification. So one of the challenges for level 3s is there are residency restrictions all over the state. There are, few landlords where, places where they can go. And so sometimes some of the, they just run into greater challenges with finding housing, keeping housing, maintaining residents. And so this can contribute to, the need for them to re-register and re-register and re-register because they have to notify law enforcement every time their address changes. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is not every violation is intentional. And sometimes it's circumstance. And this is one of the reasons why we do see some departures in these cases. People may actually be trying to stick to the requirements and really some of the things that happen to them are beyond or, outside of their control. So this is why I supported the idea of not having the mandatory minimum on the first one, but not the second one, to kind of give them that, potentially give them that initial benefit of the doubt or break, but then, not to let that go on. I'd be open to considering keeping it for level 3s, but I just wanted to put out the other reality that it is harder for that group to comply with the requirements of registration than the people who have those lower levels.
Thank you, Kelly, and everyone. Are there other things to talk about before we move on to the agenda regarding 243 or anything that we've talked about? Okay, then I may just move on to just share quickly where we are in our process and then also make sure we save time to get something scheduled for that August meeting. So I'll share my screen again and just mention that we know from what we presented, I think it was in December, which feels like a long time ago and also a short time ago, our timeline has moved a little bit. So this bright green is sort of where it was and now where it is. But we have due date of, I think it's either the 14th or the 16th. This says the 14th, this says the 16th, but mid-August of when the report must be in the legislature's hands. So we have been working, I think I've mentioned this before to the group, on getting placeholders for the report and, ready to put data in and all that kind of stuff. I think maybe we can share that hopefully in June, just so you can see where it's evolved since what we presented when we just met in late 2025. And I know some of you were like, wow, we're putting the cart before the horse yet. We haven't even talked about anything yet. But the good news is that we have that outline template and we have been piecing things together as we can. So we can share that. But we're looking at, it sounds to me like we're going to be getting data still through June, and that comes from the different subcommittees with a heavy write period to get things merged in with MNJRC's information and with Rob and Robina's information, anything else that comes up really after the June through July meeting. So we can talk a little bit about what revision and stuff looks like at the next meeting so that we know how that process goes. But this is our timeline as we understand it right now. Are there any questions about that? I'll stop sharing then. And agenda-wise, I know we want to save time for public comment too. So I guess, Don, I don't know if you want to share anything about where we are with the date yet, if we have consensus or if everyone's voted.
I have not gotten comments from everybody yet, but give me a second. I can share. This is what I have so far for our responses. And I mean, just looking at it, it looks like the 4th from 1 to 4 is the best. It has no conflicts that have been identified so far. For anyone who's online that has not responded, are any of you not able to do the 4th?
That's afternoon, right?
Yeah.
What was that?
Okay.
Yeah, 1 to
I'm
4.
available on the 4th, 1 to 4.
I probably am. I'm going to be on call for a trial that week, so I can't say definitively, but likely.
Understand, it's a long ways out there, and I know Nick Sasser is not on. Ashley?
All of those dates work for me.
Okay. I think then we have a consensus for the 4th from 1 to 4.
I have a housekeeping question, really for Mark. There's I think the legislature finds it useful to have actual bill language done, and I've got like concepts for the entire bill language set that I'd like to run past somebody, and I'm wondering if I could run that past your committee. Like just take a look at the proposed bill language and finalize that with, I guess, with the caveat that the revisor's office assists with final bill language, and I envision that after the task force is done, that I would basically send our proposed bill language to the revisor's office for finalization and getting it into shape. But Mark, are you okay with that process? And anybody have any objections to sort of how I see things? Mark Osler, yes. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, sure.
So,
be happy to.
Yeah, I just think there are 2 Marks. Thank you, Mark. My experience with legislative recommendations is that they go down easier if there's already language proposed, so that it could just be jacketed and introduced. So are we at the public comment period, Julie? Is that where we're at? Okay. Don, do we have any members of the public online who would like to make a comment?
We do have somebody on. If you do have a public comment, please raise your hand and I'll elevate you up. They did not raise their hand.
All right, well, we're giving you 11 minutes back. Look at that. This concludes the agenda. We've got the meeting dates set for, again, these will all be 9 to 12. I think it's evident why we need that much time at this point. We're making a lot of progress, but we've got a ways to go, and we don't have too much time to do it in. So I appreciate everybody's interaction with this. You're all on here for a reason. You're all representing an important voice. And I appreciate all of your contributions. So having reached the agenda, the end of the agenda, and there being no further business, without objection, this meeting will be adjourned. Hearing no objection, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.